welcome to A State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. Today's episode is a good one, and I'm excited to be back here releasing another episode in 2021. First, a little housekeeping for the podcast. I realize it's been a while since I have published an episode. Like I said on the podcast recently, I really want to put out quality over quantity. That being said, I have some amazing guests and plans for A State of Mind podcast. I'm planning to put out about an episode every other week. Sometimes it will be more often than that, and I'm going to do that for at least the next 6 months. I want to share a message from Jay in Colorado who said, "I just discovered your podcast and listened to 4 episodes yesterday. I feel super inspired. Keep up the good work." So thanks, Jay. Thanks for writing. And that's a lot of listening in one day. But I love hearing from people who just discover this podcast, who go back and listen to some of the older episodes. And as always, feel free to message me through our website, stateofmindplay.com, or we're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So I just wanted to take a moment and share a bit about what I've been up to before we get to today's conversation, which is with Daniel Ingram. So more on that in a moment. I just completed an 8-day meditation retreat, and I did it here in my apartment. So it was just me and my dog Sailor. And with the global pandemic, still raging all around us, most retreat centers and in-person events are canceled. But I just wanted to share with everyone, you can always do something like a meditation retreat on your own. You don't have to have a group setting in which to do it. And I would recommend doing it in a way in which you are connected with a teacher or with a group who can support you and give you any advice that you may need, and to just support you and help you with the process. I think there's a lot of value in just being seen and doing something like this. Meditation retreat is not always easy, and this one for me was quite challenging at times, and it was also really inspiring. And it felt poignant and meaningful to do it over Christmas and the holidays, to just be alone here and to be practicing and to think about all the people affected by coronavirus, all the isolation and suffering that this pandemic has brought. I was feeling super inspired the last few days of this retreat, and then after it ended, I experienced a kind of crash, and I just felt kind of off, just energetically for a few days, and then it felt like quite a challenge to get back to work, to get back to my normal life. And I'm mentioning this because meditation certainly has many potential benefits. It also has many potential downsides, and that's actually part of the subject of today's podcast. So just to wrap this up, I feel a number of good effects from doing this retreat, and I want to just name them here. One of them is just a new sense of inspiration for my work and for what I'm doing. I have noticed an improvement in my memory and mental clarity in the days since. And after feeling off for a few days, I then started to feel much more energized than I had before. And I feel like I've noticed a deepening in my ability to be with people in my work as a psychotherapist, and that feels really rewarding. So all that being said, I wanted to add here that any sense I used to have, because I did used to have this sense of the path or meditation as being this kind of linear path. And any sense I had of that linear path has been kind of totally blown up for me. So while in the long run, I do believe that meditation, especially with proper teachings and guidance and support and community, can be very beneficial and deeply transformative, I also know that there are a lot of potential pitfalls, a lot of ups and downs, and that your felt subjective sense in the short term you may not feel like progress is getting made. Like that can be part of the path too. You can go through what has sometimes been called a dark night of the soul, and that can last for days or even months or potentially even years. And again, that's something that I get to talk about a little bit with Daniel Ingram on our podcast episode today. So I have found great value in sticking with meditation practice over the time and showing up for my own life and my relationships as deeply as I can. So today, I'm speaking with Daniel Ingram. Daniel is a hardcore meditator, and he wrote an amazing and ginormous book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see me holding it in my hand. It's a huge book. You could probably give someone a concussion with it. And I really appreciate it. Daniel is someone who has stirred up some controversy because he has proclaimed himself an Arahant, which means someone who has had real lasting realization of the Buddha's teachings. And we don't really get into that in our conversation together. You can look it up online, you can have your own thoughts or opinions about it. You can read about the controversy in his book, because this is, I think, the second edition of it. But I really appreciate Daniel. I really appreciate his flexibility, his openness. I appreciate his perspective that the Buddhist teachings are something that can be practiced and realized in this lifetime. They don't have to be something that only superhuman, super special beings from the distant past have attained. It is a living tradition. And so I'm not going to cast any judgment on his own claims. That's not the point. The point is, at least as I see it, that there are stages of realization, and it is possible to achieve them if you put in the work, if you get the right teachings, and it's obviously an unpredictable thing. So please refer to the show notes for a breakdown of all the topics we cover, because we go through a lot. One of the things we talk about is his efforts towards research in meditation and bringing it into the mainstream of psychology and modern medical science. So Daniel does a good job of discussing how the modern mindfulness movement kind of cut off or ignored the extreme highs of meditation practice, which could include things like awakening, and the extreme lows, which could include things like the dark night of the soul that I mentioned, or very uncomfortable, somatic sensations, or feeling like your world is falling apart. Things like Kundalini awakening, which could lead you to going to the hospital, right, and experiencing these symptoms like seeing lights or being disoriented or feeling altered in extreme ways. And Daniel is working to have things like Kundalini syndrome be a part of the medical vocabulary, be a diagnosis that you could receive so that you could then receive the appropriate help rather than being misdiagnosed and potentially given treatment that doesn't fit what the issue is. And I really admire and support him in this work. We also talk about the very real possibility of transmission and the real value of authentic lineage. So Daniel's not someone who is dismissing the authentic lineages of meditation at all. In fact, he has great respect for them. We also discuss the phenomena and practices of magic and the importance of being able to shift between different contexts and ways of understanding. So you'll hear him say something like, well, from a magical point of view, I would say this, or from a more rational, logical point of view, you could say that, and to be able to hold these different perspectives and kind of juggle them. Daniel shares an amazing story of interviewing a patient who had multiple near-death experiences. He was apparently one of the first people to receive a pacemaker, and that was a really sweet and moving story for him to share about this person who had crossed that line of near-death experience, or even, in his own words, death. Like he said that he had actually died and come back more times than anyone else alive. And so it was just fascinating to hear that and touching. And another thing that Daniel and I talk about is this phenomena of self-directed negativity, negative self-esteem. And I really see this as one of the major mental health issues for people in the modern world, especially in America and the West. It's just amazing how in traditional Eastern culture, the concept of self-hatred did not even exist. For example, the word for the self in Tibetan language literally translates as self-cherishing. They didn't have a concept or thought or an idea that people in general could hate themselves. And so we talk about that and some of the ways to work with that. And then we discuss the possibility of millions of people learning meditation, learning mindfulness, just in the same way that millions of people today learn about nutrition, learn about sports and physical exercise, and that these basic techniques could be shared and learned and practiced, and they could lead to different levels of awakening across our society. Yes, this is utopian thinking, but it's also something that is very possible. We all have the potential to look at our own mind, look at our own consciousness, and come to insights about it. And those insights have the potential to free us from our constant mental struggling, constant mental suffering. So much of our mental suffering is, in the end, unnecessary. We don't have to go through life like that. Quick note about this conversation, our Zoom recording failed on us, unfortunately, so we're only going to have the audio of my conversation with Daniel, and it begins kind of mid-sentence, so we just kind of jump in. I think the first 60 or so seconds were lost. I apologize for that. And without further ado, I bring you Daniel Ingram.
Clinically skillful functional awareness of late-stage interesting meditation phenomena stuff that I spend all day long talking with people about to the clinical, therapeutic, and public mainstream. Beautiful. And currently working to establish some international charity organizations to help fundraise for and support that work. So that's a lot of what I do. That will probably end up being called e-benefactors if the trademark clears.
Okay.
So, yeah, and so that's what I spend most of my time doing these days.
Yeah, I think hopefully we'll get into some of that stuff. It's just
helping people with meditation. So that's another thing I do is yeah.
And so, I mean, one of the things I realized about you is it sounds like you talk with a lot of people, a lot of meditators, and you do it for free. I think that's beautiful.
That's true.
That's amazing. So I appreciate that.
The people who taught me for free. They didn't require payment. Literally none of them. A lot of the time I was like so underfunded and undercapitalized myself that I couldn't afford even give donations of any real consequence during that period of my life, because it was career-wise very unstable, even if my Dharma practices started to do pretty well. But the two didn't blend well together at that point in my life in my 20s. And so, but I'm extraordinarily grateful for all the teachers I had who gave very generously in the open spirit of these teachings being considered priceless. And so I do my best to try to pass things on in that same spirit. Now, I'm blessed at the moment. Luckily, I'm insufficiently popular to be overwhelmed by that offer. So I can still keep up with the load. I don't know if that will ever change at some point where I just can't physically find the time to talk to everybody. But I also go out of my way to try to refer people on, to give them other resources, to connect them to networks. I'm not looking to be anybody's long-term teacher. I don't take formal students. So I will help people, but I'm very much here's what I got. Here's what I would tell you. Here's some advice. Here's other people to talk to. Here's networks to connect with. And I think communities and peer-to-peer stuff, with teachers or whatever you want to call people, and that sort of model is much more comfortable for me than single point of failure. I'm the teacher and you're the student stuff.
Yeah.
Makes, it's not that I can't drop into those roles temporarily, but I try to get out of it as fast as I possibly can, and have people help each other in that sort of more collective way. I get the sense a lot of people were doing back in the day, because when I read the old texts, there were a lot of people wandering around India back then, just trying to figure stuff out and helping each other out and saying, hey, I learned this. Hey, you learned that. Let's sit together and share the Dharma. And
yeah, absolutely.
So I, try to model something of that ideal.
Yeah, well, I think you raised a lot of good points right there, but one of them being a more collective, perhaps, approach to, something we could talk about is like this guru-disciple relationship that holds a lot of potential and promise. It can be very romantic. Like people, at least I used to imagine that I would meet that person one day and it would be like, welcome home, son, like this father figure. And they would take, they would answer all your questions. And even if that works out for you, or you think you have that situation, and like what you just said, like if there is a scandal or a betrayal and your whole path has been put on this one person, like that could be very obviously damaging to you. So.
Right. And we're a bunch of mammals, and that aspect of human nature needs to be acknowledged. As a friend of mine who's actually currently ordained as a monk in Thailand pointed out an interesting Robert Thurman article to me, and I think it was in Tricycle. Anyway, it was a pretty cool article. And he said, the best guru is one who lives 3 valleys away. I think it's an old quote, not his originally.
Yeah.
And the point is, that way you don't get to see how human they actually are. And you get to engage in that whole dance of projection and idealism and all that. And while I can super appreciate that sometimes that can really work out well for people, there's no question, there's thousands of years of evidence that can be extremely effective. And I get it. On the other hand, we have ample evidence today that it often is entered into with a high degree of naivete and the potential for real harm and exploitation. And so just being mindful of the possibilities of it going both ways, keeping one's wits about one, and again, having fallback optionality and various perspectives on this path, I think can be incredibly helpful. Because at least I myself, while I've had some super cool teachers, I've never met one that I thought had whatever I would think of as everything. You know, that was like the total package, whatever some idealized total package would be. And in fact, none of them have been even close. And some people would say, oh, you haven't met the right guru. You know, when you meet the right guru, they will be that. But in all honesty, I don't quite see that anywhere. They would simultaneously be super loving and kind and also, you know, able to be strict when they need to be, and that they would have excellent boundaries but be incredibly open, and they would be extremely heartful and intuitive and yet extremely well-read and analytical and scholarly, and they would be deep practitioners who have tons of time for social work, you know, and like whatever you like, you know, all of these things that you just, it's like sort of the ideals of like the super mom from the 80s, you know, that would like, you know, have two careers and be a, you know, incredibly successful this and raise 2.3 children and take them to all their games and be there for all that and be, you know, this amazing wife and like, you know, like it's incredibly cool idealism, and yet it's also an ideal that is a lot of people found very hard to actually manifest as ordinary humans rather than as super beings.
Right.
You know, so
yeah, I guess I could share. I haven't talked about this before in the podcast, but I don't mind naming them for whatever it's worth. I could share, like, I was really inspired by the teacher Reggie Ray, Reginald Ray, who's here in Colorado and helped me connect with my body, and he's
very good for that.
Yeah.
That's great. One thing he's super good for is that body grounded awareness stuff.
Yeah. And so I did this month-long retreat with him, and I was so inspired by him, and I really wanted to do his more advanced retreat. And I had an interview with him, and he basically said, if you want to do that retreat, you have to take me as your guru or your teacher, and you can't have other Vajrayana gurus. And I rejected that, but it was really hard for me at the time. Like, that interview was so hard for me. And
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And but I knew enough about the history of Tibetan Buddhism to know that, like, that wasn't true. Like, his own teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, had at least 4 main teachers, probably more. So it's like, why would he be saying that you could only have him as a teacher when his own teacher had had multiple teachers? And I never liked that kind of thing, that kind of narrow, this is the right way, other ways aren't, you know, the authentic way, which kind of seemed what he was saying. So.
Yeah, and again, you know, all teachers have their flaws and their quirks and their weird stuff. I don't mean to excuse anything needlessly, but,
yeah,
you know, we're all, you know, we end up in these situations usually because we're kind of different and kind of quirky and something like, you know, there are certain personality characteristics that tend to make one more end up on some sort of front cushion role. And it, you know, the degree to which that correlates with ability or appropriateness, lots of people could debate endlessly and do. But, you know, the fact of, again, mammals with human conditioning and their own attachment styles and their own relationship to things like loyalty and exclusivity and control and money and power and all that is, you know, we all have our different styles, and some people find it really annoying that I'm constantly like pushing people out and say, yeah, go talk to them, you know, like, you know, call me in 6 months or something if you want or not.
Yeah.
You know, like some people really find that super annoying, right? Because no, they're like, so like, and I get it, but both can be a problem just in certain contexts or with certain people or, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a spectrum and a moving spectrum, and different people also have different needs at different times.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, that's something that I appreciate about you is like acknowledging these different practices. Like I listened to a podcast you did where you expressed real gratitude to all these different teachers, including things like 5 Rhythms dance and.
Oh yeah.
You know, I feel the same way. Like I love 5 Rhythms dance just as an example, but like yoga or so many things that we can learn from and grow from. And I guess it raises the question of lineage, which is so important in Buddhism, and transmission, and a teacher passing on this Dharma transmission, you know, teacher to student. Do you have anything you want to share about that? It's kind of a big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. There's clearly a there when it comes to transmission. I mean, I could feel it. When I was on this retreat with Sayadaw U Pandita Jr., I could feel he was transmitting something. It was a palpable energy and invitation and quality, like a radio beacon or a light bulb in the room. Like, it was palpable. And if I had, I don't know if I had just seen the same words he said to me written down, if it would have had anything like the impact of the presence of sitting with him, or plenty of teachers actually I've been with transmitted something, I think, of their wisdom, and they also transmit their quirks, right? So that's the other thing. It's not just the only thing you're getting transmitted from them is their wisdom. It also can be their neuroses as well. So both of these things transmit. We think transmission only applies to positive stuff. It also applies to negative stuff, I think, basically equally. And, people who...
Interesting point.
Yeah, and people who somehow end up on front cushions tend to be radiators. That's why they end up being put on front cushions, with hats and stuff. That people have recognized they're radiative, transmitty. People get something out of them in some palpably powerful way. And so people keep showing up because they're like, wow, there was some value here. I could feel something. I noticed something, and so that whatever that capacity is, I don't mean to get all woo woo about it. Is it just mirror neurons and charisma, or is it actually like energy magic, or is it, the divine light shining through? Like, those are all interesting ontological assumptions, which may or may not have value. I'm promoting or criticizing any of them necessarily, pick what works for you. But is there clearly some kind of an effect that you can put some kind of language on? Well, absolutely. That's, I think, undisputable. And then you could argue about the mechanisms or the meaning, but the fact of the effect is there. And as literally millions of people have noticed around the world over millennia.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, so that transmitting thing is real. Okay, cool. The sense of lineage in some ways is real because, I never would have figured this junk out on my own. I was not that smart, right? When smart people who had spent thousands of, drawing on traditions over 2,000 years old and lots of technology that had been developed over millennia told it to me and gave me guidance in how to see it, I was able to see it. And that there is some sense of, you're learning a craft from another craftsman. And there is something that is, you do become influenced by that. You become programmed by that in some way. And so, pick carefully the people that you're going to train under, because you will adopt something of their style. And hopefully you will take much that is good and leave much that is bad, right? Because no teacher, I think, is going to likely be perfect if you look carefully. And just like in medical school, there were some professors, I don't even remember, but there were a few whose model of how to be a good, kind, thoughtful physician was just so inspiring that I literally just found myself imitating their phrases, their bedside manner, until it became more of a natural part of me, sort of a CBT, fake it till you make it kind of thing. I'm just going to try to be like them because I could tell that really worked better than what I was doing. And so I ended up becoming some sort of imitation initially, and then it just kind of became habit. And it wasn't imitation, it was just kind of some part of who I had become, a little different, filtered through my own take on whatever I thought they were doing that was cool, but it just became sort of second nature. And so choose carefully the people that you're hanging out with if you're going to hang out with them for a long time, because it is likely you will adopt not only something hopefully in their wisdom and their techniques, but also their style, their neuroses, their language, their quirks, their energy and patterning, right? Because that's what we are. We pattern match off of the circles we find ourselves running in. That's just how we learn and grow and adapt as humans and socialize. Yeah. And so, and then the question of lineage in terms of are you properly lineage transmitted is one of these sorts of weird things that comes up all the time. And is that a social designation? Is that something somebody can externally verify? I recently had some YouTube comments on a video I did recently with Guru Viking about an article that was written about me. Yeah, and someone was like, you should go to a Dzogchen or Mahamudra master who could just look at you and assess your degree of attainment. I was like, that's interesting. And maybe such people exist. I don't know. I mean, the world of magic and powers is fascinating. But, so is that the standard? Maybe. When the Buddha was asked this according to the Theravada tradition, he basically said, be lights unto yourselves. They said, how do we know who the Arhats are? It's one of the very last questions the Buddha was asked before he died. And he very much said, you need to be lights unto yourselves. You need to help each other and support each other in community. You need to, try to follow the path of the Dharma. But he didn't give the kind of, he didn't give an answer like, go to the person with psychic powers, who, has that skill set, and they will tell you who the Arhats are, for example.
Yeah. No, you just said a lot, and I appreciate it. And I remember it just made me think when I was first getting into Buddhism and then Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana, I had this idea that there were these enlightened masters, and they were the people who could tell if someone else was enlightened. And then over the years of observing things and learning more, there's so much politics, right? Or sometimes it's in the family of some of these lineages, and so ideally that would be true, but I don't really see that happening in actuality. Maybe it happens occasionally, but it seems
it's very political.
Rare.
It's very cliquey, often. In groups and out groups and social scenes, and who managed to play politics well and became the abbot of some monastery or whatever. If you follow, I don't mean to rag needlessly on Thai Buddhist politics, but if you follow the inner workings of like Thai monastic news and scandal and politics and financial stuff and everything, you find that a lot of people who rise, or some unfortunately high proportion of people who rise to the top of running major organizations may have risen to the top through skill sets that are something other than purely their wisdom. And maybe their political skill or ability to manipulate political situations or something.
Yeah. Well, the other thing you just, and I agree with that. The other thing you just said is just about human learning in general, how we learn from people. When you're in medical school and I think we could see it with musicians or with athletes, right? Like a good coach and the way they transmit something beyond words. And I think that's beautiful. I was just going to say, you grew up in North Carolina, right?
I did.
So did I. So
where?
In Raleigh. And then I went to Chapel Hill for undergrad.
Oh, yeah. I was 9.5 years at UNC, and I moved to Raleigh in, I think, 1973, and then was there, and then moved to Chapel Hill, I think, in 75, 76, I think, and lived there. That's where I grew up and went to high school there. 9.5 years at UNC, undergraduate, master's, med school.
That's a great school, yeah. And then another thing I heard you say on one of the podcasts was something about like your efforts towards and your meditation practice compared to the effort and stress of being in medical school. And I thought that was such an interesting thing that you could share because you've been through both. And it just made me think like if the average person meditated as much as we, watch TV and work at our schoolwork and career, like what kind of results would we see?
Hopefully great ones if you had good instruction. And this is a terrible thing to say, that clearly some people have more tolerance for the path, more talent in the path. I know people who are just vastly more natural at this than I am. They just, on way less effort, were able to do things that took me so much more time and work to do. And I see a great range when I talk with people. I see people who have spent, I talk with people who have spent tons of time on retreat and practice, and they've never really crossed the arising and passing away. It's all psychology and back pain and issues and sort of wide sort of psychological level integration, but no real investigation of phenomena, no jhanic factors arising. And then I know other people who, with no retreat time, got into some amazingly deep insight territory. Wow. And there's this incredibly broad spectrum of kind of natural talent as well. So that just needs to be taken into account and I think studied to some degree.
Right. Yeah, that's like the role that study or philosophical understanding plays. That's been really emphasized with a lot of my teachers, especially in the Tibetan tradition, of like having the philosophical underpinning and then practicing and doing both. And I think it's fascinating to think about. Like, for example, you're a big map person, and so I've been delving into that a little bit. And that's a whole other subject. A lot of people meditate for years and years and never think or look at these maps or take them that seriously, or they put them as very far removed, like only very, very, very advanced meditators are reaching these stages. And it's easy to take them away from something you could reach, perhaps. But just knowing about, I guess what I'm trying to say is our intellectual understanding and then our actual experience and how they intermingle and interrelate, and perhaps...
That's obviously a huge topic, right? That's one of the great, that's a many thousand-year-old conversation.
Yeah.
And I also know, it's worth knowing, I know people who are not particularly philosophically or theoretically inclined at all, who also still have super deep wisdom, very intuitive, immediate experiential wisdom, but not fancy terminologically or conceptually, but they've still got the real thing. And so just recognize, and I also know people who are unbelievably intellectually sophisticated with profound textual Dharma knowledge, whose meditation practice may be comparatively superficial, let's just say.
Yeah.
So, and that's also been noted. And there's often more of a tension between, the degree to which there's tension versus harmony between the scholars and the deep practitioners. That's an old theme, right? And then the people who seem to be both, how they figuring out how to balance those two things, to not let the ideals get in the way of practice, but also allow the ideals to show you things about experience and point to aspects that you might not have, noticed. There's two sides to that coin of that dance, obviously. So, and this is nothing profound. I'm saying, this is meditation problems and complexities 101.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
When I practice, I'm actually a very intuitive practitioner. I almost, the amount of time I spend on the cushion thinking about maps, since, other than in my early days when I did much more of that, is very, very slight. I mean, I can't help but notice stuff, but it's just like seeing a street sign. I don't have to read a stop sign to know that that's a stop sign, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, one question I had for you is, you talk a lot about connecting with the physical sensations in our body, right? In terms of practice.
Yeah, actually, all the sense doors.
All the sense
doors. So, yeah, I mean, the physical body is extremely important, but particularly when people are stuck in their. I mean, the classic thing for the early to mid, meditator is being lost in thought and then trying to bring it back to something.
Right.
And for that, the body is a fantastic anchor, though sometimes a bit boring for some. Which is why I also like fire casino practice, so which is usually more visually interesting, and we're often very visual creatures. And I like open-eyed monitoring practices too. I don't talk about them nearly as much in my book because there are other books that do a very good job of that. It's interesting. People often think that my book is a really good reflection of me and the techniques I do, when it's also in some ways a compensation for things I didn't see done as well out there. And then I reference all these other books to say, hey, Lot Kelly did this thing really well. Go check out his stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And then I just say that in one sentence, and then I don't have to do any of that because he's already done it, right? Or something, and so these sort of open, immediate perspectives or whatever, someone already covered that kind of, I don't need to, redo that material. Okay. It's fine. So I think, but staying in the body can be super helpful for a lot of things, for not spinning in thought, for finding the feeling component of emotions, for getting to understand things about pain and when it's there and when it's not there, as well as cultivating bliss and ease and well-being. I mean, we feel well-being in our body. We feel bliss and spaciousness, in our body as much as anything.
Right.
And then just sort of being here. Obviously, bodily sensations for most people are very here in this moment, as opposed to, say, thoughts of past and future, which, while the experiences of thoughts of past or future are occurring now, many people sort of habitually, when those arise, disappear into the content and sort of imagining an actual past or an actual future from that sort of immediate, experience frame point of view.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my question is there something about the physical sensations in our body and meditating with them that's intrinsically better or going to lead to greater insight versus the other sense doors? In particular, I'm thinking about visualizations and mantras and things like that.
I know for certain that the sense door does not matter. Okay. So you can go all the way through the stages of insight using a mantra. You can go all the way through the stages of insight purely on visuals in realms of abstract geometry or just reigns of, pixel sort of, TV static. You can go all the way through, it's one of the things we do on fire casino retreats. You can go all the way through on there's a monk who teaches the tinnitus, the ringing in the ear, where you just take that as object, and you can go all the way through the stages of insight on that one. It doesn't matter. Conformity knowledge, which is the gateway to levels of awakening and fruitions and all that stuff, the stages of insight, is object independent. It does not care what the object is. It could literally be anything. It can be a frustrated feeling. It can be a memory. It can be an expectation or anticipation. It can be a physical sensation, a sound, an aggregate of things. It can be a jhanic factor. It can be space. It can be consciousness. It can be anything. It doesn't care. And so it's just that you perceive the three characteristics of it. So, but that said, it is definitely true that some people have an easier time with certain objects. So some people are just way more visual and just thrive in visual practices. And some people are like way more tactile and just thrive in tactile practices. Some people are more auditory. And so my initial advice to people is generally lead through strength, whatever your sense modality is, initially to try to get some traction in the game, to try to get some sense of the there that's there, to try to get some progress that's easier rather than more challenging. I often actually advocate that people lead with their primary sense modality if they know what that is. Not everybody knows well what that is, or they may even think it's one thing and then try it and realize it's something else. That's okay. But to be able to get some sense of what insight is about and an appreciation of the three characteristics and a mind that is relatively free of hindrances, or actually even the hindrances. You can take conformity knowledge can take the hindrances object as easily as it can anything else. Yeah. It's just harder for most people to see the three characteristics of them.
Right. Well, but
they're actually fascinating objects, in the experience.
I really appreciate that, and hearing that feels really good to me. And I imagine it's helpful for a lot of people that we can go with what works for us, and there's not, so I think that's great. I guess one question I wanted to ask you is, in Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism in particular, and I think it's true, with spiritual practice in general, but, we're saying prayers for other people, for other beings, and we're doing practices that are like sending out light, to help people. Do you think that is actually helping other people, more than just yourself? Like, how would you think about that?
Yeah, so it's worth knowing I have something of a pretty, sort of mid-heavy magical background as well. Right. So I do magical practices. I'm very comfortable thinking in magical terms. In certain situations when that is helpful, I'm very happy to shut all that off. In other situations where that is not helpful. But since you've asked a magical question in a magical frame, in a magical context, then I think from a magical point of view, the notion that is actually doing good is valuable. So there's endless and ample evidence that we are connected in ways that is beyond what we would initially expect. The literally countless examples of people who suddenly felt like something was horribly wrong and called up some family member randomly in the middle of the night to find out something bad had happened to them. I could go on. The literature on this is robust. And so if you're interested in that kind of stuff, just pick up like The Power of Eight or The Intention Experiment by Lynn McTaggart or Real Magic by Dean Radin and read. They're not perfect books, but they have a lot of really good points. I don't think there is a perfect book. Actually, my book is certainly not perfect either. But they have a lot of very thought-provoking and interesting stuff about this. And do I think that intention ringing in the world is important? Yes. Even if you were purely being hyper sort of cynical and materialistic, the simple fact of visualizing that powerfully, if you can actually get the feeling of like loving light radiating out of you, the amount of good you're doing to your own nervous system and concentration abilities and body and everything by getting into those states is profoundly healing and transformative. Right? Just what you have to do to even be able to get to the level of meditation, to be able to do that for most people involves a lot of healing, overcoming a lot of obstacles and barriers, a lot of developing a lot of clarity and really just good mental wiring, right? And then the fact of doing it, even if it's just for you, is incredibly healing. And by healing yourself, you help, the whole world. You're changing, our brains are plastic and remold and remodel depending on what we do with them, as anybody who's ever learned any skill or played an instrument or done anything else knows. And so in the same kind of way, those right skillful patterns on the mind of how to be in the world. But again, I'm totally comfortable going to the magical level and saying that magically it is very likely doing something else. I've had too many curious experiences of energy healing at a distance and other stuff like that, that I'm like, okay, there's no way that's just random noise, right?
I love that. That's great to hear.
So I think that's powerful, real stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. I like the way that you speak about that. And sometimes for me, if, just thinking or imagining that there are other people or maybe other bodhisattvas or Buddhas or however you want to think about it, maybe angels sending out love and light and like tuning into that and opening up to that, like just that can feel really healing. And whether
that's
it's
a fact.
Yeah. So I think there's something there. Yeah.
That's one of the central pieces of tech of most religions.
Right.
Is the sense of being healed by the divinity. I mean, that's one of the primary things divinities are supposed to do, is heal and protect and help you and guide you. And so to be able to, countless people across countless traditions have found immense value in being able to tune to divine love or healing or protection or safety or guidance or whatever it is.
Yeah.
The possibility of abundance or a good future or some good outcome. Yeah, that's kind of religious tech 101, and obviously very popular for a reason.
Right. Well, it's at the same time, like you could get into mindfulness and do a lot of meditation today and not, everyone's different, not judging, but I think it's worth sharing that that's a possibility too. Like you could bring that kind of thing into your practice. Where do you stand?
So I think the section of your book, my book that you probably didn't read, was Magic and the Brahma Viharas.
Oh, yeah.
So I actually have a whole chapter on basically the Brahma Viharas being one of the highest, cleanest, best forms of magic, and the argument for why I think that's true. It's a fun read. You might enjoy it.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to the rest of your book. Where do you stand on the question of past and future lives? Just to throw that out there.
So I've had past life experiences that were super profound for me.
Okay.
I'm a strict ontologically agnostic empirical pragmatist. Which means, do I say those are true past lives or not true past lives? I have no idea, right? I'm totally comfortable in the ambiguity of that. It doesn't detract from the experiences at all that were super powerful. They felt at the time very much like any other memory I've ever had in my life of my, ordinary childhood or whatever. They had that same ring, that same quality of course, and they were also oddly explanatory and kind of normalizing and like insightful. So they didn't just have the sense of, oh, I was this and I was that. They also explained things about me now, like, oh, wow, because I was at this, I seem like I do this now. Oh, wow, I've seen a habit that directly relates to that life. I've seen a tendency or a quality or a like or a dislike or a challenge or whatever it is that seems to relate to that life very straightforwardly. So when they talk about this in the old text, that's not just sort of, I entirely get why they found those experiences compelling and wrote as if they were valid, because they have that quality of important, compelling validity.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they truly are, but I can report as just a human experiencing these things, that's what they felt like at the time. And they also not only were explanatory, one of them was super transforming. So I had one of them that I am functionally, structurally different and better because of.
Wow.
So I'm incredibly grateful for that one. And so I also know people who have had past life experiences that have been kind of troubling or challenging, that involve death or torture or bad situations. And so some of these are not all necessarily positive, but sometimes there can be some kind of healing or recognition that comes through. Something. It's a very complex topic. It's as complicated a topic as dealing with like early childhood memories.
Right.
It's got that same kind of power and complexity where it's,
Yeah, I think that's a good connection. We don't, typically speaking, don't have conscious memories before the age of 3 or so, and a lot happened. But I like how you answered that, and whether or not it's objectively or ontologically true, who knows? But a lot of people who have a lot of meditation experience have some kind of memories of past lives in some way. So.
Right. Yeah, but psychologically and functionally, my strict ontological agnosticism is irrelevant in the face of the experiences.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they're true, but it means it doesn't impact the degree to which they can psychologically benefit me and have.
Yeah.
So it's possible to hold both in the same mind at the same time, and be very functional in the face of that.
Well, and then on a related note, do you have anything you want to share about death, about like how you would approach that or think about it? Or
Yeah, and I want to defer to more of an expert than myself.
Okay.
So I had a remarkable experience where I was interviewing patients in the Durham VA hospital, Durham, North Carolina. Yep. About their healthcare, and I was just doing some survey work, nursing research. And after I had helped this old guy with his survey, he said, "Hey, why are you doing survey work?" And I said, "I'm thinking of going into healthcare and maybe medical school." And he said, "Well, you might be interested in my story." I said, "Sure, go ahead, I got time." And he said, "I'm something very, very rare in this world. There are only a few of us that have ever survived, but I'm something called a flatliner. And I received one of the very first pacemakers that was ever put into a human being." Oh. And back when they first became available, because since I was a kid, every so often my heart will just stop for like 4 or 5 minutes, and then it will start again.
Oh, wow.
And he had basically all of the past life experiences you've ever heard of. He said he had, I think, something like 40 or 50 times he had died before they got the pacemaker in him, or sort of kind of mostly died, and been truly just flatlined with no heart rate, no pulse, just totally collapsed. And he said he had every past life experience you've ever heard of, the classic one with like the tunnel and the shining light and the voices and your family and going up and feeling like you never want to come back, and to going down to hells and seeing people tortured by demons. And then he described other strange stuff like, sort of alien landscapes and weird abstract stuff and all kinds of things. And I said to him exactly the same takeaway, because, maybe nobody in the history of the world has died more times than him. I mean, like, that may be true. I don't know. Like, it's an outlier. I've never heard of anybody other than him dying anything like that many times. Yeah. And having anything like that many past life experiences. Huh. And I said, "What's your whole take on the whole death thing?" He said, "Yeah, do not be afraid. It'll be fine. You're fine. Like, have no fear. I have no fear of death at all. It'll be just fine. I've done it so many times. No problem." So I will defer to him as the expert on that, because, how do you beat that level of expertise? I don't know.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a hell of a story. And if that's
yes,
true,
it is.
I mean, it's to have no fear of death is no small thing. And sometimes I wonder, we are so, especially maybe our culture today, I've seen it with coronavirus, but we're so afraid and freaked out by death, and many of us never experience it or really see it, at least with a human, in our life. And when someone dies, we remove them and we beautify the body. And I wonder if that is all rather unnecessary. I don't know, like some of the fear. And I mean, of course we don't want to die. I'm not saying that, but
I think the fact that death is now so removed from us is definitely a problem. So when you grew up on a farm back in the day, you would have seen lots of animals die. Mm-hmm. A lot of people would have seen hunting, and you would have killed things. You would have seen family members die at home. You would have seen, some reasonable portion of your siblings die of childhood illnesses. You would have seen people die in war and starvation and plague and famine and flood and everything. Even if you've spent time in Nepal and India, you see way more death right out in the open.
Yeah.
I spent time at one of the first things I did when I went to India is spent time on the burning ghats of Varanasi,
I did that too.
Benares. Yeah, just watching bodies burn.
I remember the smell.
And that was profound. Yeah, kind of like barbecue. It's a terrible thing to say, but sort of true. And but yeah, weird. And then, like in medical school, when you dissect a corpse down to fragments for 160 hours, that's a profound meditation on death and impermanence. And then working in ERs, I got to see a lot of people die. Adults, kids, accidents, expected deaths, totally unexpected deaths, everything. And it does give you more of an appreciation of the normalness of that, of the inevitability of that. So it's interesting, when I fear death, it has nothing to do with the dying. It has to do with the fact that I don't want to die prematurely and have left important work that I hope to be able to contribute to the world undone.
Yeah.
That's the fear I have around it. So
beautiful. Yeah. Well, and on that note, I wanted to move into psychology a little bit, and some of your research, like around the medical, bringing some of these meditation experiences to the realm of more medical mainstream science. But I have a question here. like in my work, I work as a therapist now. And so I'm really grateful for that work. I get to sit across from people and do my best to support them and help them. And something that I've observed, first of all, to be honest, I observed it in myself a bunch in the past. And now I observe it in people I see. And it's this just avalanche of negative self-esteem, self-worth, negative self-talk. And like when I think about it, it kind of doesn't, it's not logical. It's like, why do we, so much of us have that? Is that something about our culture in particular, or is it something
Yes.
we're learning? Or, okay, do you want to speak to it?
I can't give you all of the reasons for it, but it is explicitly a part of our culture.
That's bizarre, right?
Right. And so like one of the things that the Asian teachers, the traditional Asian ones, when the Westerners first came, and they would talk about this all the time with their Asian teachers, they literally would say, we have never seen this. I don't even know how to handle this. They at first, apparently, a lot of them just didn't believe it. Like they couldn't really even hear it or understand it. They didn't understand the depth, the tragic and epidemic death. Sorry, death is the wrong word. Depth of it, and breadth of it and expanse of it. They didn't understand the degree to which this was a serious problem in the West, and they were shocked by it. And it was outside of their experience. And they found people who couldn't even follow the simplest of instructions because they were just caught up in their negativity, their anger, their resentments, their bitterness, their conflicts. And it is really true. You just don't see that in traditional Asian cultures in the same kind of way. And, our mental health statistics are unbelievably bad.
Yeah.
Right. We have levels of depression and anxiety that, unless you're in like a war zone or something, or in a refugee camp, you just don't see in a lot of the other countries in the world, period. Right? It's just, and even if the material circumstances might be vastly worse, or the government might be way crappier than our government. 2020 and the last 4 years have been challenging, but still, like, we still have a lot of great things about our governments go. And in the same kind of way, these people may be living in really circumstances that you would think would cause levels of stress, and you literally do not see it in the same kind of way. It's not like there can't be a lot of stress and poverty and living in, countries that have more level of economic dysfunction. That, no question there is. But from a mental health point of view, we take the friggin' cake. And I think advertising is a substantial part of that, right? Constantly, you need to be better, you're not as good, the constant bombardment. People would not have been constantly bombarded by ultra pretty photoshopped, glitzy people with fancy new things. And constantly, you have to do this to have that, you have to do this to be okay. And then there's the whole social media thing. We literally saw pediatric emergency department cases more than double in our pediatric ER because of social media, period.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
So kids presenting in psychiatric crisis literally doubled because of Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram and all of that stuff.
That's terrible.
And particularly bullying and peer pressure, and to be known, to be seen, to be heard, to conform, the level of emotional fragility, the level of lack of emotional stability and intrinsic sense of self-worth and tolerance. And we also saw, bullying just 24/7. So it used to be, you might be bullied on the school bus, and then you got into class and you were kind of safe, and you might be bullied at lunch, and then you got into class and you were kind of safe, and then you were bullied on the school bus home, and then you get home and you were kind of safe.
Yeah.
So that's like a few select periods during the day where you might be kind of vulnerable, and then you got home and you're all right. Now it's 24/7 with the kids on their phones. They never get a break from it. They never get away from it. There's no refuge. There's no downtime. There's no escape. And to be social means to be in that world and to be exposed, and to cut yourself off from that world means to have no peer network. And so it's amazing to have that level of social connection, but the dark consequences of it literally have made kids present in psychiatric crisis to emergency departments more than twice as often.
Oh, that's incredible.
And that's a serious friggin' problem. Like, I'm not on Facebook, period. I do Twitter, but I don't, pay that much attention to it. I'm very careful about who I follow mostly. And so the social media has definitely contributed to that, as well as the information silos that we're all in, right? Where the the lack of coherent social narrative, and even what the news is, and even what the facts are.
Yeah.
That's incredibly psychologically stressful for people. And the rapid pace of change has also been incredibly stressful. And I don't mean to needlessly blame semi-narcissistic generations, but let's just say the boomers may have thought a little bit more about themselves and their kids.
Yeah.
I don't mean to,
I think it's
got to be careful here. And so the kids didn't get something, right? I mean, I heard this all the time. What is it that the millennials and Gen Z and stuff didn't get? Because they didn't get something. And trying to figure out what that is important. I think I was the last of the generations, I'm a Gen Xer, that we're okay, kinda, like I'm okay. And most of us were kind of basically, a lot of us were kind of basically okay. There's trouble and divorce. We have super high divorce rate among our parents, but we were also sort of more independent and self-assured, independently rather than in social connection. And we were the last generation to fly out of our parents' houses with some reasonable degree of reproducibility.
Right.
That's totally different from what happened to the generations that came after us, where they didn't fly.
Right.
And part of that is economic, and the fact that the wages were way less for them. Part of that is social, part of that is expectations, and part of that is they didn't get something that functionally made them more independent. And what that missing secret sauce is, I don't know, but the effect of it is undebatable. Right?
Yeah.
This is not just some dude's opinion.
Yeah.
Like, this is statistically and socially a huge trend. And what that is, I don't know. And what the boomers didn't get something that made them kind of sort of obsessed with themselves. Like they didn't get something in their broader institutional altruism and sense of social cohesion that the greatest generation, for example, got. The greatest generation was missing some things as well. Now, there are great things about each of these generations also, like the millennials and Gen Z, like they've got all kinds of cool, interesting social skills and, other senses of altruism and global connectivity and different sense of social justice. And like, they got like, there's super cool things about these generations as well. But in terms of the sense of, am I okay? Yeah. Am I all right to take risks? Am I all right to break things, to go out, to do stuff? They don't have that in quite the same way.
Yeah.
Right? To be independent, to fly. It's missing. And that's hard. So each of the generations kind of they got screwed up in different ways. Right? There's a fascinating documentary I just highly recommend people watch that explains kind of some of the back history of this through the 20th century that is worth watching. And it's The Century of the Self.
Yeah.
So if you haven't seen that, just watch it. It is so worth it. Yeah. And it talks about Freud and advertising and what public relations and advertising created consumer culture and created markets and demand and an attempt to create social cohesion basically through endless need and then fulfilling that need with material product.
Yeah.
Unbelievably friggin' damaging.
I couldn't agree more. I think you just said a lot of that's what you just shared is really important. And I don't
know if that's sort of a shotgun approach, but sorry for the interruption. But
no, yeah, I mean, I think for sure the marketing, the advertising, the filling emotional needs with consumerism is a part of it, but it's a complex thing. But at the very least, we can, it's true, and we can name it. And I think talking about it can alleviate some of the stigma around it and alleviate some of the sense that only I am this fucked up. Actually, a lot of people are feeling this in different ways. And
yeah, no, the fucked upness is quite widespread. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so fascinating for me to think about these, teachers coming from the East, coming from Asia, and not even having words in their language to describe something like self-hatred. Like, it's just amazing to think about. So.
Or the thing with parents, right? Like, they would say, visualize your mother and your father.
Right.
Like, because of course you would love them. Yeah, that didn't work out so well. Yeah, and we're not prepared for that. Like, they were like, huh? Don't you love and respect your parents? Yeah, no, a lot. The answer was straight up aversive no.
Well, so one way you could approach this kind of thing around self-esteem, I don't really like that expression, but, replace a negative self-belief with a more positive one, like I am worthy. And what Buddhism can offer, is like going beyond the self altogether. This is a big question that's been debated in Buddhism and now in psychology, but in my experience, like you can have some sense of transcending yourself, of insight into selflessness, and then come back to a baseline of like myself is something bad still. Like, does that make sense?
Oh, that happens all the time. Yeah. People have these momentary glimpses, these peak experiences, get into insight stages where they see unity of consciousness or transcendent bliss or a sense of divine love or interconnectedness or momentary sort of hints of non-duality in things. And then the vast majority of those are fleeting, are transient, and then they come back and they've seen something and they know there's a there, and it may have touched and integrated to some level, but there are many levels of depth for that. So the vast majority of those experiences are transient. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so where do you stand on the question of, some people are saying you need to have a strong positive sense of self before you can transcend the self versus just going for the transcendence?
I don't know that that's true at all, actually. Okay. I know solid examples of it having gone both ways. I know lots of very, very sort of psychologically, seemingly very integrated, self-actualized in the ordinary psychological sense, people who are very mature and just really have their life together, who are not that great practitioners. And I also know people who are kind of train wrecks and sometimes even like really super unstable with like severe mental illness who are friggin' badass practitioners. Like, wow. And some of them crazy as the day is long, and nutty as squirrel poop, as we say in Alabama. And but yet, man, they can do cool stuff on a cushion, and they can talk about non-duality and deep wisdom. Oh, hey, dog.
Oh yeah, it's my dog.
Oh, cool. What's your dog's name?
Sailor, like Sailor Moon.
Hey, Sailor. Cool. I like dogs. And so I've seen it go both ways, and I also know people, who have neither of those, and both. I mean, I know some very wise people who are also very well integrated, and when I think back on my own practice, that I was like some very psychologically sophisticated person in my 20s when I was like plunging into the depths of weird meditative territory. I don't really think so. Did I have a tolerance for pain and a capacity to follow instructions? I had that. And so I would say, I don't know that you need to be some strong self, but you do need ego strength in the Freudian sense. Because ego strength or just a high degree of natural talent. I mean, I know some people who just have so much natural talent, it didn't take them longer, that much work. They didn't have to deal with that much hard stuff. They're just they're Mozarts, and what can you do? Or Jacob Collier's, these impressive people who just have gifts. All right, cool. But for the rest of us who didn't have quite all that, the things that really help are ego strength in the Freudian sense, which is the ability to look within and not freak out.
Nice, yeah. Beautiful, yeah.
Well, right? Or if you're freaking out, to be okay with the freaking out, right? Because there's freaking out that is like, yeah, no, I'm just freaking out. It's all right. Let me check out the freaking out.
Right.
And then there's people who are, the freaking out is not okay.
Right.
It's not okay freaking out. It's just bad freaking out.
It's a good distinction.
And so you have to have something of that capacity to do that, to go in and to feel pain and not freak out in the face of it. Yeah. To go, yeah, there it is. To feel vulnerable and go, yeah, there it is. To see, our flaws and quirks and go, yeah, there it is. To see our humanity and our disappointments and our embarrassments and our grief and our guilt and our shame and sadness and fear and desires that are unfulfilled and weird dreams and quirky fantasies and all of that, and to see that and to go, yep, there it is.
Right.
And so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the paradox of transactional analysis, which has sort of gone out of vogue, but I hope to bring some attention to because I think it's a cool psychological framework anyway. But one of the big critiques of it was like its foundation is like, I'm okay and you're okay.
Right, yeah.
And start from that place. And then the counter thing that happened historically to that was, I'm not okay, you're not okay, and that's okay. Those are both important.
Yeah.
So I think you need both of those.
Right. That makes sense.
Like that's the synthesis of that thesis and antithesis.
Yeah.
And if you have both of those, you'll likely be a lot better on this path. I
like the way you said that. Yeah, you did a good job in your book of talking about and raising this question of when we're meditating, of getting into the content or more psychological healing perhaps versus seeing the nature of it, right? That seems like such an important distinction to talk about in meditation, and it takes ego strength, like what you just said, to stay with the practice and look at the nature of it rather than getting caught up in the content of it.
Mm-hmm. And yet the content is also important. So to give both sides their due, again, to try to present some balanced perspective on this. I had an interesting dialogue with a guy named Parletra, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is how he goes online. And he's a professor of psychology at a university in California. But he was like, these techniques cause some problems because I get people who are insight meditators or mindfulness practitioners into me to try to do therapy with them, and he'll say things like, "What are you feeling?" And they'll be like, "I feel some tension here. There's some like warmth here. There's some like." He's like, "Yeah, no. What are you feeling?" And they're like, "Well, my throat's a little tight. There may be some." And then he'd be like, yeah, no. Like psychologically, what emotions are you feeling? And they're in order to do psychological work, you kind of have to be able to go archetypal. You have to go into shadow. You have to go into the stories. Mm-hmm. You have to go into the content. You have to go into the past and future. You have to go into, if you're doing internal family systems, the inner childs and all these like voices within us, that have these perspectives. You have to be able to go into that in a way that is not just seeing, oh, these sensations come and go.
Right. Absolutely.
And so to do that work, you need to be able to shift into that way of working, just like, magical perspectives. Sometimes a magical perspective is helpful, sometimes totally not, right? And to be able to choose wisely. And I think there's a time and a place to be able to choose 3 characteristics, 6 sense doors, just noticing sensations arise and vanish, see their true nature, and all of that. And that's super important when you're doing that kind of work. And there's a time to be able to go, no, right now I'm in communication with someone, I'm looking into issues, I'm looking into content, I need to shift frame and work at that level. And to prioritize or privilege one over the other can be seriously problematic sometimes. And we don't always get to choose. Like sometimes there are issues coming up, really kind of addresses issues. Yeah. I see a lot of people say, well, I've been seeing the impermanence of my, flawed relationship for years now, and it hasn't helped. Well, like, yes, I can see that wouldn't help.
Yeah. Well, another...
Right? You're like, that is not a surprise that didn't help you much.
Yeah, that's a good example. Well, another thing I heard you say is if you're going to work at or towards waking up, it's worth it to have a life that's worth waking up to.
Absolutely.
That's a good way to say it.
Right.
I think that's a great point about being able to transition between different perspectives, different modes, and not being stuck with one. And I think talking about the downsides, potential downsides of meditation practice is so important and something that we need in our culture. Whereas mindfulness is often talked about so positively and it can help everyone. And yeah, that's true, but there's a lot of, like, you've done a good job of raising awareness about things that it could bring up that could be really difficult. It could be destabilizing. It could, things like disassociation, things like what you're just describing, where someone asks you how you feel and you're great at describing these sensations in your body, but you're not able to have a human interaction exactly. So it's good to like be aware of some of these pitfalls, right?
And people usually assume that those skill sets will translate. It's something I talk about all the time. That, of course, if you can notice sensations come and go, you would be a great conversationalist. Like, what? Or really altruistic, or have really green politics or whatever people imagine would come from this. Those are real stretches of logic from my point of view.
Yeah. So I appreciate it in your book. You distinguish these axes of development, and Ken Wilber in Integral Theory does a good job of doing that too. There's different ways we can develop, and they're not necessarily related. I could be a great guitar player, and I could also be an asshole. Or I could be a great meditator, or I could have great concentration perhaps, and not be very good at interpersonal relationships, for example. And I think it's important to have that. That just seems true to me at this point in my life.
Do you play guitar?
I do. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Nice. What style?
Kind of like improv, jazz kind of stuff. Yeah.
Nice.
Jamming.
Are you playing a Gibson 335? What do you got?
I actually have a PRS, but it's a Korean-made one, so it's not the real fancy one. But
Still.
Beautiful guitar.
A PRS is an exquisite guitar. I mean,
yeah,
you know.
So gorgeous.
Right.
Do you play music?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you play?
I've got, here, I'll sort of,
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. I've got a pedal board and everything.
Yeah, like, you know, and here, let's see here.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's musical stuff lying all over the place. Yeah. Yeah, I do. Play some guitar and bass and do some electronic stuff sometimes.
Oh, cool. Have you seen like your meditation practice influence that, or how does that play in?
They've interacted in complicated ways. I mean, sometimes it's been super fun to take my internal musical abilities and make mantras just orchestrally, complicatedly awesome. Sometimes songs have seemed to sort of, in my early days, sometimes songs stuck in my head, I would think of them as interfering with practice. I probably should have just taken them as interesting objects. It's probably the wrong way to relate to them. I think my appreciation of timing and pitch is better, just from being able to listen better.
Yeah.
I think my appreciation of ability to like hear harmonies and stuff is a little better, just because I think my ear is more present. Yeah, so I think it's helped my music some, but for years it actually really didn't. I didn't play that much through my 20s, which is when a lot of people are kind of playing because I was dedicating my time to practice. So in some way, sometimes it interfered with my musical hobby.
I can relate to that.
And so it's gone both ways.
Interesting. Well, what about, maybe this is a funny question, but if you're getting your level of focus and concentration and insight to such a fine-tuned degree where the continuity is disrupted, right? Like the normal sense we have of ourselves as being a continuous person can get disrupted when you pay really close attention, as you see.
Yeah, thank God.
Thank God. But in terms of music, like a song, like if you focus to that degree on the sound, it would kind of disrupt would you even be able to hear the song? Does that make sense?
Oh, no, I totally hear the song. I hear songs better.
Okay.
There's more intrinsic clarity. I hear more parts better. I hear their timbre better. I hear tone better. I hear spatial separation better. I hear, and I feel reaction within my body better. So I feel like when I'm reacting to music, that's all more clear also. And so that enhances the experience. No, it is also true that I hear more flaws in music more easily, like subtle things of timing. Like there's some Beatles songs, there's a few places where the timing is just slightly off that annoys me, or certain pop songs where I'm like, that snare was just a little late and I can't not hear it. It doesn't mean I could play that well. So my physical coordination might not be good enough that I could play the snare any better than they did or whatever, or whatever vocal thing. I'm like, that was just slightly off pitch or something. So I hear both the beauty better and the complexity and the richness in the parts better, but I also hear the flaws more. So both are kind of true. So it just kind of made both more. Like, it's like, if you buy a really good pair of headphones and you go back to listen to songs you're used to listening to in like your car or something, you buy like a good pair and you put them on and you're like critically listening, you're going to hear all kinds of both good and bad that you never heard before. Like, wow, that bass part kind of sounds kind of out of phase there. There's some weird warble I never noticed on the low end. Like, how did the engineer miss that? Stuff like that. But then you're also like, the beauty of like a beautifully done performance where you're just like, oh, that was so good.
Nice.
So both are true.
Yeah, no, I like hearing that. I guess my question, to put it more, to use a different analogy with like a movie, say, like part of the enjoyment of a movie is getting swept up in the story and the characters. And if I'm watching,
I can do that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, of course. But if I'm watching a movie and I pay attention to like, okay, each moment I'm seeing a bunch of flashing light and color, and there's actually
Buddha had a great answer to this one. Someone said to him, apparently, Buddha, are you aware all the time that you're enlightened? And he said, no, but it's there anytime I choose to notice that aspect of things. And in the same kind of way, I can tune to continuity or tune to notice the frames of the movie. And sometimes one or the other will show up because, say, stages cycle through that have a different relationship to experience. So I still cycle all day long through insight stages, vipassana jhanas, or whatever you want to call them. And each of them has a different phase relationship to attention and body and space and the speed of perception and all that. So those do cycle through and they each have their own vibe. But independent of that is also the sense of like really, paying attention to a movie versus just noticing you're in the room and that's a screen with pixels on it or whatever.
Yeah.
So But I haven't found this has detracted from my ability to appreciate art or performance or anything. In fact, I find it much enhanced.
Oh, beautiful.
Like I used to get more easily fatigued by museums. Like after 3 or 4 hours in a museum, I still can sometimes get a little bit, but I get way less fatigued in museums now than I did. Like I could spend 6 hours in the British Museum, for example, and still be appreciating the freshness of what I'm seeing. So in that way, it's definitely been enhanced.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I guess, so part of what you're describing is through your meditation practice, reaching a point of where there's been some permanent shifts in the ways that you are. And that's really cool to hear about. I don't know what words to put there, but just to have someone openly talk about that as a possibility. And this idea that our mind is malleable and we can, to some degree, change it, shift it. Do you want to speak to that? I mean, I kind of think like an analogy of like bodybuilding. You know, if I start really in the weightlifting, my body will shift. And to some degree, we can do that with our mind. I wonder to what degree that's possible.
Yeah, to extreme degrees. I don't know the ends of it. I don't know the limits of it by any means, for certain. What I do know is that the general direction is trainable. I don't know what the limits of concentration are or magic or any of that. And I continue to be surprised and find new and interesting things to develop and explore. So it is kind of like bodybuilding, but it's more than that. It's almost like sports training, because you could get like really buff, or you could get like really fast, or maybe you learn one skill really well. Or some people are just kind of broadly athletic, and you put them in kind of any competitive situation, they do pretty well. Yeah. And other people are super specialized in one thing. And people have different talents and gifts. Like when I used to run, I'm an okay mid-distance runner, like 3 to 5 miles, but sprinting, not so much. And do I think my body is built to do half marathons or marathons? I really don't think so, actually. Maybe I could train to do that, but I don't think I'd ever be great at it. And in the same kind of way, we all have our talents and our capabilities, but they're definitely skills we can develop. And it's also possible to go back and round out things we're not as naturally as good at. That doesn't mean we may ever be quite as strong in those things. But there are lots of skill sets that are well defined, that are things you can learn to do. Just like I can learn, like my acoustic playing and my electric playing are very different things, even though they're both guitars with 6 strings. Yeah. I play very differently on my fretless bass than I do on my fretted bass. It's a different thing. Yeah. And, sometimes I'm better at one than the other because I'm playing it more or something. And so that even shifts. Like I have skills that I gain and I lose. Like if I'm doing a lot of one type of music, like then, when I go back to some other thing, I'm going to be like, I have to kind of retool those skills sometimes. Right. Yeah. And that's the same with meditation. Like there are meditative skills that sometimes on retreat I've been super good at, that right now if I tried to do them, I might not be able to do them at all. But when I was really powered up, I could do them really well. Or practicing that style of practice or that technique or with that focus really well, I could do better than I could do now. So these things also, it is also like bodybuilding and losing mass and capability also. Because like to stay really pumped, you got to be doing it all the time, right? Or you get a lot of shrinkage, as they say. So. Yeah. Interesting. But some skills remain. So that's the interesting thing about the insight stuff. Once those switches are thrown, they seem to just be thrown. Yeah. Well, and I know you have a great chapter on laying out different models of what awakening or the path can look like. And I've heard, from the more Dzogchen Mahamudra point of view that I've heard, it's like we're getting in touch with this, they often use words like true nature or however you want to talk about it, but something that actually doesn't depend on effort to maintain itself, right? Yeah, because it's something that stopped. So you actually stop doing things. The process of identification can stop in stages. It's an active thing where at each moment the mind is trying to figure out where it is in relationship to stuff. Are these sensations of the head the thing that's going to pretend to be observing the nose? Are these sensations of the eyes the thing that are going to be pretending to be observing the screen? Is this mental impression the thing that's going to pretend to be the knowledge of the thing it was the mental impression of? Is this intention going to attempt to be solidified into a true doer that really is an agent rather than just a transient stream of intentions that are naturally happening? And so with each moment, the mind has to figure out where it is in relationship to everything. That habitual process actually takes up like a bunch of mental processing power, and it turns out is totally unnecessary. And in fact, involves this actually weird, very rapidly moving selective blindness, where you notice just enough of the experience to turn into a self, but not enough of the experience to see that it's just more transient stuff happening now without a true past or future to it. You know, and so like that weird selective moving blindness is actually an active, irritating, annoying, clarity interfering process, just like when you're, you know, like you're on a DSL connection or like what, you know, you've got cable internet and like it's 7 o'clock at night and suddenly everybody turns on a movie and your bandwidth on your video call goes to crap, you know, because a lot of that bandwidth is being taken up by your neighbors who aren't on the same internet connection kind of. In the same kind of way with this weird process of ignorance, it takes up a reasonable amount of perceptual bandwidth and does involve moving selective blindness. And that's just kind of a water muddying sort of a thing for the brain to do. And it turns out totally unnecessary.
It's unnecessary.
Right? Yeah. And actively harmful. So, and it can stop and you're not just fine, you're better than fine.
Right. That was, that's a beautiful description of that can stop this unnecessary process. I wonder if, when you talk about like meditation, mindfulness, like going to scale, like spreading out across our contemporary society, like do you think it's realistic to think about what you just described, some kind of basic kind of awakening and letting go of this process of ignorance as being something that millions of people could tune into to some degree, or is that like utopian thinking?
It is both possible and utopian thinking.
Okay.
Right. So it is possible to imagine a world where this is the training you got as a kid and you learned how to do this and everybody was learning to practice like you would learn math or your language or whatever it is. I mean, you know, plenty of utopian fantasy novels and things have imagined awakened societies where spiritual training was just an integral built-in part of how you grow up and what you learn to do. Like kids learn sports in school and they have PE, and of course you would learn advanced meditation. You know, and some people would be better than others, and some end up, you know, star athletes, and other people just play tennis on weekends or whatever. Right. But where that is more built in. So that's certainly a possibility. And there are cultures where meditative training, you know, is to some degree more valued, or spiritual training is to some degree more valued, or contemplation. You know, they've existed and to some degree sort of do exist. And it is definitely true that through the work of mindfulness and lots of other groups like Goenka, et cetera, mindfulness and the capacity to access meditation and deep teachings and places to practice, I've scaled in unbelievable ways. Right? Yeah. And then the only thing I want to make sure is that people appreciate the full range of what can happen, both good and bad. Right? So that's where I now spend all my time trying to work on that part of the puzzle. Whereas, like, to get into the clinical mainstream, they didn't want to talk about both the extreme highs and the extreme lows, because that was just too weird. Right? And so they had to make this, as I frequently call it, a Faustian bargain of sort of cutting off the top and the bottom and selling the middle. And saying the middle is safe, you're just paying attention, what could go wrong? Well, as people who have done serious meditation know, plenty. And what could go really right, also plenty. But that was too weird at the time. Now I think ethically we have to embrace both of those ends of the range, because literally clinical medicine knows nothing about this stuff. Mainstream therapy knows nothing about this stuff. Even the vast majority of people teaching mindfulness practices have little to no awareness of what can happen, both very wrong and very right, or very weird, and sometimes in strangely small doses. Not that many people, but enough that it should be known. And so I think we're going to have to figure out ways to build that into the healthcare system if we're going to do this ethically, responsibly, and fairly, and to be able to have the ethical conversations of what are the risks, benefits, and alternatives. What's the range, and so you can make an informed choice about whether or not this is something you want to train in, and whether or not you're okay with the risk profiles of various traditions and techniques and emphases and styles and intensities of practice. And to also know that there was a system there that could support you if you ran into trouble, or a system there to support you if you really wanted to excel, right? Both. And so expanding out our societal capabilities to handle all of that, I think, is a critical component of scaling this in a responsible way.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message, and a timely one. And I think there's a very similar conversation to be had with psychedelics. Like, we're in the psychedelic renaissance, they're coming back into mainstream psychology and therapy, and obviously there's dangers, and obviously there's benefits, and for some reason with psychedelics, it's kind of impossible to ignore that extreme high and extreme low. So,
meditation has the same. It's just not quite as quick or as dramatic for most people, though there are exceptions. I mean, I know people the first time they ever meditated, like beyond psychedelic level crazy explosion stuff happened. Is it common? No. But does it happen? Yes. And so, actually in the EPRC studies, very much like all of what we call emergent practices. So psychedelics, daily life situations, the vast range of spiritual trainings, but people can get into this stuff also with none of that, during childbirth or during beautiful moments or transcendent moments or very traumatizing moments. People can suddenly find themselves in some kind of insight process, and sometimes for no obvious reason, and sometimes even as kids. There are countless stories of this and examples. And I've talked to plenty of people who have ended up in very interesting spiritual territory, quite accidentally, it seemed to them. And so having enough of a broad public awareness of this so people can recognize what's going on, and if they need help, to know who would help them, and just have that be a normal thing. Like, hey, if you've got a cavity, you go to a dentist.
Right.
This is known, right? In the same kind of straightforward way. We need some branches of the healthcare and therapeutic systems to just own this and say, we're the people who, when this stuff happens, we know how to handle it, and we train in that, and we specialize in that, and we do the science on that.
Yeah.
And just to own it like a mature specialty would.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I think normalizing some of this stuff and talking about it and bringing it into the so-called mainstream, like things like Kundalini awakenings, for example, or all the kinds of experiences that can be. Yeah. And I guess we could do that. I mean, I can imagine that being done without the medical establishment or whatever it is, mainstream psychology, making value judgments on it. It's just like, this is a possibility of the human experience, and this might, I can learn something about how to help you through it.
That's what we're hoping for, because right now there is some subtler or overt value judgment on it. Right? But just like, I wasn't judging people who came to me with weird experiences from migraines.
Right.
Like, like, I've seen weird wiggly lines. Okay. I can't feel half my body. Okay. Like, like migraines do all this weird stuff. We don't say, you just go, okay, migraine, right? In the same kind of way, this.
Yeah. Well, and we're starting to get into territory that questions scientific materialism. I think that's where the kind of difficulty
Does
it is. Or maybe not, but that's how I tend to see it.
Let me tell you the degree to which I don't think it necessarily does. And this is my ontological flexibility. Sure. So I'm not going to say scientific materialism is true or not true. I'm going to remain strictly ontologically agnostic. But what I am going to say is, imagine what the scientific materialist model actually is. Okay? Let's think through this carefully just for a second. Is this actually white?
No.
No. Scientific materialism says this is not actually white, nor is this actually right here. This is a representation in a brain somewhere that is somehow emerging through a hand-waving emergent process we don't know anything about, that somehow atoms and molecules are creating consciousness, with the hard problem being how the fuck.
Some mystery, some mystery happening. Right?
It's a mystery. So there's mystery hand-waving, but the basic model is, is this actually soft or warm in the way we feel it? No, those are all the way the brain represents something in the material world. The scientific materialist model says this is not white. This just happens to emit a spectrum of light that our brain, through picking up various things of photoreceptors, registers as white, but it's not actually white. It's just frequencies, right, of light. Yeah. It's not actually warm. It's just that's just a way of representing something that is actually just has a certain range of molecular vibration to it, sensed through particular nerve fibers, right? And so literally this entire space is created in a brain somewhere in response to the quote-unquote material world through some mysterious process. So, and there are endless experiments that show that you can trick perception to make it perceive all kinds of bizarre things that are not the way things are. You can put glasses on someone that invert the world. They have lenses that just literally turn everything over. And within a few days, the world rights itself and the person's walking around in a righted world. And then you take the glasses off and literally the brain flips the world black over again.
I want to do that experiment on myself. I've heard about that.
And so and there are countless examples of this. It's just one of the more dramatic ones, but there are plenty of them. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that this is clearly all just a representation, so there's nothing about magic or anything that is intrinsically contradictory to scientific materialism out of the gate. Do you see what I mean? Yes. Or any of this consciousness stuff, because this is all just some clearly flawed representational thing that we know is very malleable.
I think I agree. If we really look at scientific materialism and what it's saying closely and carefully, I mean, it's all an experience happening in our mind, and it's a mystery how that translates with the physical world.
Right.
But the kind of common sense scientific materialism that most people kind of walk around with is a little bit different than that.
But that's the problem. And so the problem is that's sort of scientific materialism as religion, as ontological bias, as not entirely fully applied. Because if they fully applied scientific materialism to their experience, they would realize it says this entire thing is basically like a holodeck from Star Trek, like a simulation, like a virtual reality in a meat brain somewhere that it's conjuring up as the way we experience things. And none of it is actually the true stuff. Mm-hmm. Right? That is literally what scientific materialism says. Most people don't take it that far, and they stop kind of halfway in this sort of weird, semi-religious mishmash of nonsense that is not actually scientific materialism in its full implications at all. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. I mean, I think for me, one example where I can illustrate this easily myself and maybe with other people is like the ideas of like beauty or attractiveness and how that shifts over culture and time and how we learn this and the programs and just the little tricks our minds play on us at times. Where like if you I'm most basically heterosexual man and I see someone at a distance and they have long hair and I think it's a woman and then it turns out to be a man with long hair, like little things like that, and you're like, the whole story that my mind just created in like half a second isn't true. And like so it's, you can catch it if you pay attention to it. But I think that's such a fascinating point. And hopefully we can raise the conversation in general. I think it's kind of like something like quantum mechanics, where like people, if you talk about it with them, they're like, that may be true in some sense, but that doesn't apply to my real life. And like, well, if that's true, at the level of atoms or whatever, then it is also true at
The quantum connection is an old and complicated one, and some people seem to sort of do it better than others. I back in the 80s read a bunch of books on this kind of stuff, like The Dancing Woolly Masters by Gary Zukav is actually one of the books that got me started in this whole thing as a teenager. It was in 8th or 9th grade science class. My teacher recommended it. And so I can very much appreciate bringing in quantum perspectives. It's hard to know what the practical value of them most of the time is, except the capacity for them to sort of open up minds about the curious apparent interactions between matter and consciousness and time, what time means, and probability versus agency versus superdeterminism. I think there's an appropriate skepticism around all of those concepts and a loosening that can come from reading about the super apparent weirdness of quantum stuff. So I can appreciate that practically. But it is also true that it gets sort of used as like a shorthand for weird mystery stuff about consciousness, which it isn't necessarily always. Does that make sense? Totally. And so I think I get why we sometimes annoy the physicists when we make some of these connections and then just sort of hand wave and like we just said something profound and we really just said something kind of vague or nonsensical. Yeah.
Well, at the very least, what you're pointing to is how much we don't know, like the mysteriousness of our
experience.
That's a fact. And so what you called kind of the religion of scientific materialism, or like the quote unquote common sense, we're ignoring that reality, that fact about reality. Like we're imagining that things are the way they are and we kind of know how they are and we don't. Well, do you want to say anything more about your research efforts in this realm?
Yeah, if any of you are interested in joining or discussing or helping or supporting or just curious about the EPRC, please feel free to go to our website. There you will find a gigantic white paper that outlines what I think is a pretty reasonable plan. This arose over about a year and a half of conversations with a whole bunch of super smart people at Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and MIT and Vancouver and plenty of other universities with very intelligent neuroscientists, psychiatrists, MD, PhD types, and therapists, and people who understand how healthcare systems work and how research works, of like what you would actually need to do to reach the clinical mainstream, what kind of science and data they're going to require. And so you can find the whole white paper that outlines our evolving plan of how to do that. It will take decades. It will cost, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars, but that's just what this kind of research costs if we're going to do it at the kind of scale and with the level of quality that just kind of ends the debates about whether or not this is a real thing and gets us on the firm enough ground of this is a real thing, we just need to figure out how to study it and relate to it well. So I think, because the transpersonal literature, again, didn't quite do that in the way everybody hoped it would. And it's easy to see why, right? Why it didn't translate the language, the quality of science, some of the marketing and messaging. It didn't meet the understandable cultural requirements of the clinical scientific mainstream. And so to try to figure out how to actually do that is what my current research project is. And that's not an easy question. There's a lot of cultural factors to overcome, linguistic factors, paradigmatic factors, taboos, and all of that, and just figuring out how to pay for it is another huge question. So if you're the kind of person who has any idea how to pay for such things, and you think that's going to be a valuable part of spirituality scaling and going forward, we would definitely like to hear from you and would go out of our way to spend the money very wisely and thoughtfully. So, and so most of my time these days has been spent learning like the intricacies of 501c3 tax regulation and how to set up international not-for-profits. So hopefully we'll have one in the US, the UK, Germany, and Australia, branches of this thing with appropriate boards of thoughtful, mature people who can aggregate donated monies and allocate them out in grants and support of this research and educational support and all of that, public relations support, data analysis support, legal and logistical support to the EPRC, which will hopefully then be able to be sufficiently empowered and supported to do the years and years of science it will take to get this right. And the biggest problem is that we're probably 20 years behind where we need to be. So it takes decades to do this kind of research, period, that you can't do it properly and do it super quickly. Like, you know, if you think about the big diet and lifestyle outcome studies that really let us know about what leads to heart disease or blood pressure or diabetes, those take a long time. This is some of that for some of the aspects of it in terms of really like rubber meets the road, long-term clinical outcomes. You just need some time. And to be able to replicate studies, if you do them once, can you do it again? You know, to really do the science properly and thoughtfully takes a long time. And so the sooner we get started, the better. But the problem is meditation and psychedelics are going to outpace us and our capacity to really have data-driven diagnostic management and cultivation strategies for all of that. And that's a serious problem from my point of view, because people like me and my friends who help people deal with this stuff, we don't scale fast enough. And the healthcare system, I think, is the only thing big enough, responsible enough, thoughtful enough, intelligent enough, well-funded enough, broadly distributed enough, monitored enough, you know, regulated enough to do this at a level that scales and is responsible and proper, and hopefully will avoid a lot of the problems that spiritual communities and the gurus and stuff who have been handling this get into. Not that you don't run into scandal in the medical and healthcare worlds, you do, but hopefully it won't be as bad. Does that make sense? Like, questions of degree. Will it be as sophisticated or as in-depth or nuanced or as deeply practiced or as well embodied? No, probably not. But will it hopefully at least scale fast enough to meet the demands of people who are getting into real territory and real insight, both good and bad? Hopefully it can do that. But again, I'm worried about the timing on this one. I think we're behind the 8 ball. And when I look at projects like this, like MAPS, so MAPS, you know, is trying to help do the real science, the FDA trials, the clinical indications. That's the hard stuff, right? That's the institution level hard stuff. They started in 1985, I think. So like this is 35 years later, and they're still just getting into real clinical trials now, and the possibility of real approval. Like that's the kind of thinking we have with this. But that should be a cautionary tale. Well, it's both an inspiring tale in terms of like someone who is willing to do that long-term institutional planning, which is what we're doing, right? We're laying in for the long siege, as it were. But not that this is a fight, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And in the same way of how long it takes, just how long you have to be willing to be in this game for to do this and make those kinds of, I think, generational level changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's inspiring to hear about. I mean, do you want to give us some practical examples of how you could see this playing out? Like some of the, yeah.
You mean playing out in terms of what the science would be or what it would look like when we're finally done?
Like just examples of, like some of the studies you're doing, and then like if someone did go to a doctor with some kind of thing that was related to their meditation practice, how that would play out. Like, I guess this phenomena of Kundalini awakenings is one thing that more people have heard of, but just...
That's one of the huge ones. So let's just take that. That's an easy one, because there's literally nothing in the textbooks of emergency medicine or emergency psychiatry about this. There's literally nothing in the DSM-5, which is, is the current Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health. There's nothing in ICD-10 or 11. Those are the international diagnostic billing codes put out with the World Health Organization. There's literally zero. So you can't actually do worse than literally having nothing about these at all. And I talk to people literally weekly that if they went and presented to a neurologist or a primary care doctor and just described their symptoms and the crazy movement stuff and energy and weird lights and perceptual stuff or whatever it is, the bizarre mood highs and lows, God knows what these people might do, because they were never given boxes other than bipolar disorder, temporal lobe seizures, crazy, conversion. Like they were given no skillful boxes. And these are smart, caring people. Right? These are good people generally. Most of the people in medicine and healthcare are good people. There are exceptions, but most are really decent, kind, thoughtful, helpful, smart people who want to know and want to be able to apply that knowledge to help people to heal and to do better. And the problem is they were never given good boxes. So we want to give them good boxes that they can put things in.
Right.
We want to give them that are shown as a diagnostic strategy, that diagnosing someone this way and then managing it this way adds benefit to long-term outcomes and even short-term outcomes. We want to do the science that shows that, and that involves clinical management trials, that involves complicated linguistic discussions, that involves translating phenomenological descriptions. So we're starting with the raw phenomenology. Oh, I'm experiencing shaking. Oh, I experience a bright light. Oh, I experience bliss in my body. Standard Kundalini stuff, right? Oh, my arm's flapping. I was talking to a guy, 2 weeks ago who was having arm flapping stuff, right? And this is a normal, highly successful businessman who, by the way, has weird arm flapping stuff when he practices, right? It's just a Kundalini thing. It does that. It's a weird one, sort of, but not that weird. I mean, it's definitely something I've run into before. And, most doctors would not relate to this well. You're going to get EEGs and MRIs, and maybe carbamazepine, or by some of the high mood highs and lows, you're going to get a bipolar diagnosis. And that doesn't mean that some fraction of these people might not have temporal lobe epilepsy or a brain tumor or some sort of cyclic personality, mood disorder. Okay, fine. Maybe some do, but most of them...
A lot don't.
Yeah, a lot don't. That's the thing. And they have this other thing, which medicine knows nothing about. And so I would advocate for upgrading their understandings of these, giving them more diagnostic options, giving them data-driven, longitudinally tested, prospectively trialed management strategies where we've compared the various things. And even actually one of the things we hope to start with earlier is something called, the working title of it is the Emergence Research Center. And if we were able to convince someone to give us, say, $50 million, then we would build the dream. And the dream thing is to have a meditation center with fMRI and EEG and neurophenomenologists in-house, literally just paid to be there, bringing all the traditions in, letting them do what they do, their 10-day retreat, their month retreat, their weekend retreat, their whatever it is, however they practice, just bringing them in, let them show their stuff, their people, and then we just study the hell out of them and see what do they actually experience, how do they actually change, in what sequence does it unfold, what is the range of practitioners as they describe this, what's their mood, their affect, their cognitive capabilities, their perceptual thresholds, and then can you see neurophysiological changes when you scan them? with whatever technologies become available, and the current technology is the best we have. And when you do, biometric measurement, heart rate variability, I have one guy who thinks I can just tell you exactly what stage you're in by your breath and exactly how it's moving and changing.
Oh, wow.
He thinks he can get really good diagnostic stuff off of that. My friend Dr. Tom Moll, who was doing a PhD in this at Cambridge until he went off to be an emergency psychiatrist, was really convinced that there are some simple ways to measure some of this, but we need to do all of that. And then we need to, eventually there's going to be the question of how do pharmaceuticals enter into all this, like doing the pharmaceutical trials. Do some people who get into serious anxiety or trouble or wild mood instability benefit, or are they harmed by giving them benzos or mood stabilizers or lithium? Those are important questions, because some people can get, a small percentage, but a non-zero percentage can get into the very far deep end of things going horribly wrong. And then what's the role of medications versus non-medication management? How much does normalization help? Can you solve a lot of this with just meditation tech that you find in the traditions? Or if you take multiple aspects from multiple traditions, can you get something that's safer and better, kind of like mixed martial arts did, right? Where all the Asian traditions thought they were the best fighting style, and then it turns out, no, none of them were. If you take from all of them and you take the best of all of them, you get something that's better than all of them. And in the same kind of way, if we drew from some of the best functionally of the traditions in terms of their outcomes, if you see them on retreat or whatever practice they're doing, or psychedelic retreat or ayahuasca or DMT or 5-MeO or ketamine or, LSD or psilocybin, whatever it is, you see what happened, and then you in their ceremony setting or whatever, and then you follow them longitudinally and see what the outcomes are, like over months, weeks, months, years. And so at least people know, if they're going to be doing this, what might happen and what's the range, and can I make, as an informed adult, can I have an intelligent, data-driven conversation about that? And then if something goes wrong, can you manage it in some way that is actively not harmful, actively more in line with what's kind of actually going on, whatever that means, or something closer that is clinically appropriate and is really adding value to care, such that people would be excited to go see their doctor about this stuff, rather than what I see, which is, no, I wouldn't tell a healthcare provider about this. Are you kidding me? Of course not, right? They know something bad's going to happen, right? And then some of these people end up in the healthcare system because it happened to them in contexts where they had no idea about it. And they're just kind of freaked out by some of the strange stuff happening. And that's where things can go horribly wrong. And my colleagues didn't want to make things go horribly wrong. They wanted things to go right. And so I thought, let's do the science to help them make things go really right.
Yeah. I really appreciate everything you just shared. And it was a good way to bring it home. And, I can imagine studies like you're talking about and how long they would take and how difficult it would be to do, but how amazing it would be to do with groups of people to get percentages. And
you need big numbers too, right? This is unfortunately kind of like lifestyle, this is like diet. Diet is hard to study. Right. This is like exercise. The full effects of exercise are hard to study. Some of these events can be dramatic, but a lot of this stuff unfolds slowly over years, and teasing that out from other effects, from socio-cultural effects, from economic effects, from other lifestyle effects, from, very, very challenging, and figuring out what are paradigms that are the most skillful for people. So lots of different ontologies. Again, I'm very ontologically agnostic, but some people really benefit from certain ontologies. And if you say, all life is empty and meaningless versus, be a compassionate bodhisattva, some people really do well in all life is empty and meaningless. It's crazy, but some people thrive in that. Tear it all down. It's all impermanent. Renounce the world. And they just that's totally their cup of tea. Right? And other people are say, no, be a compassionate bodhisattva, or this is all the love of Christ, or the blessings of Allah, or, whatever, this is Hanuman and Vishnu. Pick your favorite religious traditions. I don't mean to select out, these are just cliche big ones to mention. But, they have their explanations, and maybe those really do work well in those cultures. Maybe those can be shown to actually clearly, clinically add value to patients' lives and help them thrive and be well. Yeah. Again, I'm willing to be super tradition, non-specific, super ontologically agnostic. I'm a pragmatist. I care what helps people. Yeah. That's what I'm the most interested in.
Absolutely. It'd be amazing to see studies around something like compassion, which again would be hard to study, but could these practices, research, be shown to actually increase compassion, however you would measure that?
Right.
I was just going to
share. And then is there like a side effect where they could cause codependency?
Oh, yeah.
Like those are the kind of questions I want to ask, because that question gets raised a lot.
That's a good one.
Again, I'm not interested in like, are all compassion practices good? Of course they're good. Let's show how good they are. I don't know.
Maybe
some people, right? So we just have to be like, anything can become imbalanced. Anything can cause complicated effects. We're very complicated systems. So I want to just, what's the neutral science to the degree that you can idealize that? Not that everybody can perfectly achieve that. We're all humans and mammals, but you can aspire to that and be thoughtful about that. That's the dream.
I feel like you just kind of nailed something for me personally, because I've done a lot of compassion practice, and I've also struggled with codependency in the past in relationships, and for sure there's a connection there, because you want to make other people happy. And I was going to share too that I worked for over a year at a mental health home for people with severe mental health issues, and some of the people that would come there had backgrounds with meditation, like getting really into it, fasting, meditation, yoga, having psychotic breaks, being diagnosed with schizophrenia, and ending up in basically an assisted living home because they can't function on their own, and then heavily medicated. And the role, I talking with them about it, like the role that medication then plays is so hard to tell, because it changes, it makes your processing slower. You often put on weight. I mean, there's a lot of side effects from antipsychotic medication, so it's hard to know what they were like before that. But and it's hard to know if they would have gotten schizophrenia anyway, and it's hard to know all this stuff. But
and actually, the history of that is really complicated. The history of these medicines, their biochemical effects. Having worked in emergency departments and seen staggering amounts of short-term immediate benefit from antipsychotics for patients who were very upset about the degree to which they were freaking out and psychotic from any ordinary mainstream medical point of view. And when they're suddenly not psychotic and not freaking out, be like, oh, thank you. I'm really happy I'm not psychotic and freaking out now. Right. So I've seen that happen literally thousands of times, and administered these medicines thousands of times. So I've had that personal experience as an ER doctor who spent most of his career working in hospitals that had referral psychiatric capabilities. So people would send us stuff from the outside because we had psych beds, we had inpatient psychiatric capabilities, which not all hospitals do, particularly the small ones. And so I've done a lot of that kind of care. And then yet with the same breath, I can also appreciate some of the points of view that the anti-psychiatry movement makes, though, and I have this notion that somewhere in between, and I don't know exactly in what combination, there's a shades of gray synthesis that can hopefully come out of that dialogue between very opposing, very different, very polarized points of view, both of whom make some important points and some valid points. And so I think we definitely need more science that is, again, very agnostically neutral to those fights and traditionally neutral to those fights, that try to thoughtfully think about what is the functional truth there, and can we conduct clinical trials and use some scientific thinking that isn't bound up in, oh, psychiatry is right, or, oh, anti-psychiatry is right, to sort of lend some objective clarity to that to the degree that we can. And again, not easy to do.
Yeah, it's important.
And even the ethics of conducting some of those trials is very complicated. So that needs to be approached with a lot of thought and nuance and care.
Yeah, it's complicated, and I agree. I mean, medications can help at times, and it's hard to know how much and when to stop and all that. And then just as an aside, and I'm not speaking negatively about anyone, but when I worked at this place, I saw with my own eyes, like sometimes these representatives from pharmaceutical companies would come, and they would take the doctors out to the fanciest, most expensive restaurant here in Boulder, and they would give them some gifts. And sometimes the doctor would say no to that, and sometimes maybe they would go along. But our business model, our capitalist business model of pushing these drugs from these companies, clearly there's a lot of ethical problems with that.
Absolutely.
Whew, yeah. Well, this has been great, Daniel. Do you have any last words you want to share with us?
Well, you had this massive list of questions. I don't know how many of them we got to and how much time. We've got about, I don't know if we have 10 minutes. You said 2 hours or so.
Honestly, we've gotten through a lot of them.
Cool.
Let me look at it real quick. I think, one question I had was just around jhanas. and like how you use that word. And like I remember when I was first learning about Buddhism, the jhanas to me seem like super advanced stages, and you talk about them in ways that feel much more relatable.
Well, I can appreciate both the ultra high categorical, only this is jhana criteria in certain contexts for certain practitioners with certain capabilities, with certain goals. There is a place for that kind of language and logic. For most people, I resort to much more dimensional thinking, where it's a question of the degree to which various jhanic factors are present and the degree to which you cultivate and or eventually renounce and exclude various jhanic factors, and think much more multi-axially and dimensionally in terms of shades of gray and nuance. There's a place for both perspectives, and I can appreciate them. And it just very much depends on the practitioner and what's going to be helpful for them as I talk with them. So I'm comfortable doing both. Again, I'm a pragmatist more than I am anything.
Yeah.
So there's a room for both of those types of approaches depending on the person.
Yeah.
That's vague and non-committal, but also hopefully empowering to appreciate both of the points of view. There are times when someone says, I really want to nail the formless jhanas. We're going to talk super categorically. Right. Boundless space. No fucking bodily sensations.
Oh.
Yeah.
Like certain criteria that are very,
Yeah, no formed, defined objects with edges.
Well, and it's something that a human being can experience.
And this is doable. But doable. That's kind of rare air stuff for a lot of practitioners. Yeah. People do it, these are learnable skills. But for a lot of people, I'll talk more nuancedly about the degree to which various factors are present: equanimity, tranquility, cool bodily bliss, rapture, effort, effortlessness, all of those sorts of qualities, mindfulness, the degree of exclusion from hindrances, the degree to which it's clean, the degree to which there's three characteristics sort of manifesting versus more smoothed over by the power of a mind that's making things very smooth. Those are all dimensions to be played with, like a craftsman, like a chef who's combining various ingredients or spices for a certain effect. So those are like a dancer who's playing with movement and stillness, or tension versus fluidity. Like those are all dimensions that someone can work on as they interact with the natural unfolding of experience, and yet where does that intersect with their aesthetics, their ideals, their goal for practice, and their capabilities, and what they might aspire to, and what's realistic for them in that moment, in that phase of practice. So that is a way of thinking about jhana that is the one I default to the most. But again, I can go hardcore categorical for the few people that's beneficial for, which is, a non-zero number, but it's not most people.
Right. Okay, great. Well, I guess maybe one other question that I wanted to ask you, you can just take it however you want to, but what is enlightenment or awakening?
That could have been the whole podcast.
I know.
Right? So and again, these are words that a lot of people use in a lot of different ways. What I would say to that is, I give like a very long discussion of some aspects of this that may or may not be helpful for people in chapter 37 of MCTB. So if you go to mctb.org and read part 5, chapter 37, I talk, a lot about this and various ways you could think of it. Again, even though I have my favorite models that I'm unabashedly sort of talk about and use in my own work, I also think it's important people figure out what works for them and what working even means. So what are your goals? What do you truly want to do? What are your ideals? What do you think this will look like? How does that compare to your current reality? And then the endless question is, if awakening is just this right here, ungraspable, natural as it is, the natural mind, then any ideal that is anything other than that takes you away from that and is going to suddenly create a split and a barrier to practice. On the other hand, it is only by those kinds of ideals that we aspire to the depths of understanding and awakening and all of that pull us to a future or whatever that may have some of those understandings now hardwired into this, or if you want to use a wiring model of, how this thing works, to this being that is now part of our baseline of the way we just intrinsically perceive and experience reality, that is now upgraded, better, more clear, more immediate, more transient, more empty, more full, more whatever you want to pick your favorite language that you find helpful. And so the biggest question is navigating that weird tension between anything about goals and ideals and the fact that it truly must be found here now, because where else could you find it? And being metacognitive to that dance as we adopt models and frameworks and yet sit down on the cushion to try to be present, to be metacognitively aware of those tensions and how the best models point us back to here now and this. The best models point us to recognizing something that is occurring or not occurring, that is here or not here. The best models are bringing it right here now home to this moment. And if you find that whatever model you're using, however beautiful, is habitually creating a pattern of a split between right here now and awakening, there needs to be a metacognitive something that examines if there's a more skillful way to relate to that.
Beautiful. I love that. Whew. Yeah, it's a lot of paradoxes we run into. So I guess one last related question, and I know we're getting near the end of our time, and it's another giant question, but in the Buddhist traditions that I've studied and practiced in the most, the Tibetan and the Vajrayana, there's a big deal made between, at least at times, like an Arhat and a Bodhisattva and a Buddha, and this idea of the Buddhas. Like, I guess I just wanted to get a sense of, in your own, to make it more practical, more pragmatic, that like, is that a distinction that you think much about or holds a lot of weight for you, or is it?
So it is definitely true that there's lots of ways to define arahatship. Even in the Pali Canon, There's lots of different ways that this is defined, and lots of possible criteria, older and later, that scholars debate and have their favorites and things they don't like and all of that. And it's then also true that plenty of traditions reacting to the Theravada crafted their own sorts of straw man is a little bit of a harsh word, but straw man of what the Theravada is. And then the Theravada is this: it's selfish arhats who wake up for themselves and have no compassion for anybody. And we're the better bodhisattva way because we actually care about people other than ourselves and give a fuck. It's a little harsh, but it's basically that. Or arhats just get stuck in the bliss of their realization, and then eventually bodhisattvas have to wake them up. And we're the people who actually appreciate that we're going to be the great bodhisattva warriors that exist lifetime after lifetime, waking up Buddhas and saving everybody because we eternally exist as empty beings, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And so you get these sorts of, that's the, and then the Theravada looked at the Mahayana and generally just ignored it and went on doing what it did.
But even in the Theravada, isn't there a distinction between the Buddha and the Arhat?
There is. And so there's all these maps and models, and a lot of it is advertising, a lot of it is propaganda, a lot of it is standard public relations, a lot of it is one-upsmanship, a lot of it is maybe some making skillful points about you really should care about other people and not just be self-absorbed in your practice. That's a skillful point to make, even if sometimes perhaps a little bit unskillfully made. And what's your favorite definition of arahatship, and what does that functionally, technically mean in terms of capabilities is super complicated. How does that in the rubber meets the roadway compare to actual living bodhisattvas versus the ideals? So if you look at like the 10 bodhisattva bhumis, do they really have a retinue of 100 spirit beings or real beings or something automatically that follow them always?
I think an earthquake is supposed to happen when you get the first bhumi. So.
Yeah, can you really manifest however many zeros after the one, copies of yourself to go to all worlds to wake beings up?
Right.
How helpful are those ideals? And beautiful advertisements, or how much is that as just disempowering and just like freaks people out and goes, okay, I could never do that, so fuck it.
Right.
Obviously these are ancient debates, and clearly some people are so inspired by that they practice super well, and other people are so misguided by that they practice super badly, and that probably changes by people as they evolve and hopefully mature over time. And can I say that there isn't beauty and misery and all that? Well, there is beauty and misery and all that. There's some truth and some bullshit but even skillful bullshit sometimes is great for people and they really thrive in it, right? And so, maybe it's not entirely bullshit if you're willing to think mythologically and poetically. And then there's the scientist in me goes, yeah, but how would you do a clinical trial on this? Right. And really show that arhats are less compassionate than bodhisattvas, or bodhisattvas really can manifest 100 bazillion whatever's, or that's sort of interesting. The vast majority of people I know on the spiritual path are doing it generally to help people. Have I met any who I think are purely selfish and non-altruistic? No. Even within the Theravada, have all of the Tibetan people seemed like the nicest, most skillful help everybody people I've ever met? No.
That's
so
totally.
Just being honest, but it's a bunch of humans hopefully adding beauty to their tradition and adding myths and stories and poetry that inspire people, and hopefully have some criteria that do some good and have some reproducibility. It's something of a glorious mess. So welcome to the world of religion and humanity and advertising, and people's attempts to put models on something that is clearly very complicated. Right? So,
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think at the very least, having this, a lot of people are benefited from having some ideal that we're always striving towards, and so by having the Buddha be this perfect ideal that you can never really reach, maybe that helps motivate you. So maybe that's one way that I think about it.
And then in some ways that also disempowers, because then you're never good enough.
Right.
You have self-loathing. You'll never be a Buddha. You'll never be a bodhisattva. You'll never have the ideal. And so we Westerners, getting back to your very first question, I think about self-loathing, often can take this stuff and get very judgmental, reactive, comparative. My tradition says bodhisattvas, manifest 100 bazillion things, and your tradition doesn't say that. So my tradition's so much better than yours, and you suck. I literally get emails and stuff that say this.
Oh no!
And comments on YouTube channels and stuff that say stuff like this, right? And Dharma Overground threads that say stuff like this. So it can be beautiful and also really tragically comparative and immaturely used as well, and create a lot of competition and division. And so both are true. And welcome to the world of samsara with lightness and darkness. And, from a certain point of view, as I say a lot these days, as long as you remember this is the world of samsara ruled by the demon Mara, then what do you expect?
I think that's a good point. Anyway. It's almost like no matter what you do or say, someone could find a way to hurt themselves with it or turn it against other people.
That is absolutely true. And we all may be guilty of that to some degree. It's not like I've been perfect in this either. I don't claim, I know how to not do that and everybody else is doing that. We all fall prey to these kinds of things.
Right.
Welcome to the muck of humanity.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been great.
Cool. Hopefully that's helpful for someone.
That's super helpful for me, at least. So I appreciate it.
Cool. Yes. It's been a delightful conversation. And just, people out there, just keep your wits about you and really do your reality testing. Find a way that works regardless of what some dude on a podcast like me or whatever said.
Beautiful. Yeah. Good advice. Thank you so much for listening. If you have found this podcast valuable, there are many ways in which you can support it. You can share it with friends and on your social media. You can leave us a review on your favorite podcast listening app. And you can visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/astateofmind. For show notes and more information unique to each episode, visit astateofmindplay.com. And to learn more about my work as a therapist, meditation teacher, and coach, visit julianocean.us. And please don't hesitate to send me a message or email and let me know what you think and contribute to our conversation. Thank you so much for your support. It is listeners like you that make all this so very much worthwhile.